grocery stores, particularly I think smaller grocers, as a place where you're likely to see other people you know, almost taking that sort of third space type of role. We've got a grocery store chain in Streets that's been expanding in the city. I think they're originally from DC. And Streets, they see their target audience as like the 6 blocks around their grocery store, right? If they think it's viable, that's what they're looking at. They typically don't have parking, right? Because they're assuming people are going to walk to and from the place. So like that, if there's 10 customers in the store, when you walk in there, there's a decent chance you're going to know one of them. And I think that in itself is, from a community perspective, actually pretty important.
Let's say you bump into someone you know at the grocery store. Someone you always see when they're walking their dog, a fellow parent from your kid's t-ball team, that yoga teacher you keep promising that you'll drop into one of their classes. In certain kinds of neighborhoods and grocery stores, this kind of thing happens all the time. You say hi, ask how they're doing, share some shock about the price of eggs, and move along, your cart and its squeaky wheel in tow. But to newly elected Baltimore City Councilman Zac Blanchard, this kind of interaction is far from mundane. Indeed, to Blanchard and his political journey, neighborhood connections are the central element in building local power. Blanchard, now the councilman for Baltimore's 11th district, started his political journey in neighborhood associations. Eventually taking on the role of president in the Federal Hill Neighborhood Association, he also became involved with several other neighborhood groups. In 2024, Blanchard built his neighborhood organizing experience into a city council campaign, ultimately winning a surprise victory and unseating District 11's incumbent. Today's conversation with Blanchard on building local power charts that journey and dives into the links between neighborhood organizing and city politics, as well as exploring some of the big issues Baltimore faces. We hope you'll enjoy this rousing discussion. Zac Blanchard, thank you so much for appearing on Building Local Power. We're really thrilled to have you.
Yeah, thanks.
So to start, why don't you tell us about your political journey? How did you get interested in public service, and then how did that kind of lead to your new seat on Baltimore City Council?
Yeah. So I got involved in politics because I was really involved in my neighborhood, in my community, and I got involved. That was an intentional choice because for about the last 10 years, I've been a really big believer in the importance of social connection and sense of place. And so we made the decision. I was in the Marine Corps for a long time. My last duty station was in Annapolis. My wife had been in Baltimore. We wanted to live in a row home neighborhood where you have a chance to know your neighbors and be able to walk places and things like that. So we made the decision to live in South Baltimore and immediately got involved in multiple different things with restarting a block captain program. I coached football at the high school in the neighborhood, involved in our church, that sort of thing. And in the process of being involved in all this stuff, I kind of ran into my predecessor on a couple issues and was sort of like, sometimes you got to be the change you want to see. I was getting out of the Marine Corps, decided to ran against the incumbent. It was a very, very close race, ended up winning, I think, with 48 out of like 8,000 votes. It took a week for all the votes to come in, but ended up on top, obviously. And then I was inaugurated on December 5th of last year. So been in office for a little over 2 months now.
Great. Thanks for that. I really love that it started just in the neighborhood. I'm going to ask you more about that later. But first, Baltimore, talk about sense of place. It's a city I really love. I've been there many times. Yeah. My first book came out with a Baltimore publisher. So shout out to Mason Jar Press out of Baltimore for publishing my debut poetry collection.
That's awesome.
But for folks unlike me who have not had the joy of visiting Baltimore, can you tell us just how would you describe the city to someone who's never been there, and also specifically the 11th district, which you represent?
Yeah. So citywide, I think the most distinct thing about Baltimore and Philly are the number one and number two places in the country for the percentage of residents who live in row homes or townhomes, as I think they're known a lot of the country. Long, thin buildings with shared party walls with the homes next to you. So you fit a lot onto one street. It's just, so you have a lot of very historic homes. Our block, I think every home is older than 1900. You have the sense of history. You have the sort of, medium for U.S. standards, pretty high level of density on a very neighborhood level scale. Yeah, I think that, that in itself is wonderful. We have a lot of waterfront in the city, different things like that. The city is 60% Black, so you get a lot. But I say we're, a predominantly Black city with a large white minority. But the culture of the city, ties into that, I think, very closely as well. specifically for my district, the 11th district. So that's all of downtown Baltimore. And then what non-Baltimoreans probably know best, the Inner Harbor is also mostly in the district. And then the area south of there is a lot of row home neighborhoods. And the area north of there is some row home neighborhoods, some kind of more denser, almost downtown-like level of density neighborhoods as well. Everything ranging from kind of high-rise condos to very large public housing projects to, row home neighborhoods where, the average price may be for a new build, maybe 600,000 to, we have over 400 abandoned properties in the district alone, about 13,000 in the city. So the full scale of city life, and you see the vibrancy and the inequality really all juxtaposed together in the district very closely.
I'm really interested in how architecture senses the sense of place in Baltimore.
Yeah.
When I asked you about Baltimore's sense of place, you went right for architecture, which I think is totally true and really, really interesting. And I think that brings us back to the question of these neighborhood associations. You talk about it on your website. You've talked about it already on the podcast. Can you talk about the importance of neighborhood associations? And
Yeah.
now that you're on city council, how can city government work with neighborhood associations to make Baltimore a better place?
Yeah, so I mean, they're kind of naturally convening places for someone who wants to get involved in their community, and so that's something. It's something I like to do. Sometimes I'll get people reach out and like, "Hey, I'm trying to get involved. Like, what do I do?" I've had a couple of those conversations already, and that's like, "Hey, if you want to just get a sense of like kind of the pulse of what's going on in your neighborhood, as well as what things are out there, just getting to know your neighbors around you, because I think that really any meaningful change in a neighborhood almost inevitably has to involve a lot of people from the neighborhood, right? I think there's a lot of people, and I get emails like this all the time where someone's got a great idea and they're the only person who has it, and I've got 50,000 constituents, and so it's being able to show that there's a coordinated, like a lot of people feel this way, and we've sort of deliberated and come to this consensus. I think super important. And I will say maybe one sort of natural challenge with neighborhood associations, though, kind of to caveat it, and this coming from someone who is a neighborhood association president and all that, is you by virtue of how neighborhood associations work, you kind of sort of tend to get a lot of people there for in a reacting to a specific thing. In Baltimore, the two most common things we see are if there's a particularly egregious violent crime or a proposed redevelopment that maybe a lot of people don't like. So it can be, it's a little not natural for a bunch of volunteers, right, to be able to get together and think like proactively, like, hey, what do we want our neighborhood to be? Hey, what do we want to go after? What do we want to see that isn't here already? So I think that's always an inherent challenge with neighborhood associations because a lot of people are not necessarily going to go out and spend an hour, once a month in a formal meeting type environment unless they're mad, and so that it's kind of balancing that is always kind of important to keep in mind. But as far as how from the elected officials perspective, right? Like that's the most direct way to get to know people in a neighborhood outside of like campaign level door knocking and things like that, right? One-on-one conversations. It is a super useful way to have those meetings and say, hey, what challenges do you guys have? What would you like to see here? These types of things. Or even if you have maybe, I have an idea on X or Y thing and kind of floating that to at a neighborhood association meeting and see what people think about it. There's a lot of goodness there. I was at two association meetings last night, and at one of them got a lot of recurring feedback that they've been having. They have a wonderful park at Seton Hill. It's just north of downtown. They have a wonderful, really large park from the downtown area. A lot of challenges, I think, over the last couple of years with this city wrecking parks maintenance and upkeep of the park and whatnot. And so that's not really something that I would have ever have probably recognized had it not been that feedback from them, right? And then say like, hey, can we do a walk around where a bunch of folks like me and a bunch of folks from the neighborhood and the right person from Recon Parks get together and walk and say like, okay, what do we want to see fixed here? What are the next steps? That type of thing. Would never have come up with that idea on my own, right? And probably one person may never
Mhm.
have come up with that. It was when a group of neighbors was in a room together with an elected official who has the ability to convene those meetings with the right city agencies, right, to help solve, and is more familiar with the different tools we have to solve problems. think it's kind of where the magic happens.
That's really interesting. I guess it's interesting to me because I mean the podcast is called Building Local Power, and it strikes me that these associations and your interactions with them, that's exactly what you're doing is building local power in these neighborhoods. It strikes me as I was researching this and looking at your website and reading about Baltimore, your city and your work intersect with a lot of ILSR's broader interests. So I want to ask you a series of questions about things we're working on and have you weigh in. Starting
Please.
with on your campaign website, you list more grocery stores as a policy priority, saying if you can't
Yeah.
walk to a grocery store, your neighborhood isn't complete. Can you tell us why having a grocery store is so important for a neighborhood?
Yeah. So I think probably two reasons. One, in a city like Baltimore, you can walk to a lot of things. The neighborhoods are, for almost all the city, are very dense. Like in my neighborhood, we don't have a grocery store. If we had one, then I don't know what a regular resident would need to do outside the neighborhood in a given week, unless you work outside it, right? Primary schools, high schools, churches, markets, restaurants, bars, all those types of parks, all those types of things, right, are all within a 10-minute walk from you. So I think just being able to like route to a place and how being outside a car and being able to walk to things like connects you to your place in a lot more in a very strong way. Also, I think that there is a level of like grocery stores, particularly I think smaller grocers, as a place where you're likely to see other people almost taking that sort of third space type of role. We've got a grocery store chain, Streets, that's been expanding in the city. I think they're originally from DC. And Streets, they see their target audience as like the 6 blocks around their grocery store, right? They don't, if they think it's viable, that's what they're looking at. They typically don't have parking, right? Because they're assuming people are going to walk to and from the place. So like that, if there's 10 customers in the store, when you walk in there, I mean, there's a decent chance you're going to know one of them. And I think that in itself is, from a community perspective, actually pretty important.
That's great. And I'll just pause right here to note that both Zach and I are fathers of young children, and you may hear some children in the background as we're talking. But so it goes. Podcasting as dads. So, staying at the topic of grocery stores, at ILSR, we've done a ton of work recently about food deserts and their cause. And we're fighting for the revival of a law called the Robinson-Patman Act that can reverse the decline of independent neighborhood grocers. And in fact, pausing enforcement of that law is largely a cause of all these food deserts. But that's federal policy. I'm interested on a local level, from your seat on Baltimore City Council, what can you do to solve the problem of not enough neighborhoods having grocery stores?
Yeah. Thanks, Danny. I am familiar with that. I read a good article. I think it was in the Atlantic a couple months ago about that act, and was like, wow, that
Yeah, well, it was Stacy Mitchell, my boss. So
Oh,
we'll put
did
a
she
link to
write?
that in the show notes.
Was it in the
Yeah.
Atlantic? Or that's awesome.
Yeah, the
Yeah,
Great Grocery Squeeze. Yeah, no, the article had an amazing life, and so many people read and talked about it. So I'm glad you
yeah,
found it
yeah,
too, and we'll
yeah,
definitely put
yeah.
a link to it in the show notes.
So I mean, a couple things. One, you know, actually, we have an opportunity right now where we have a commercial real estate agent, working to sell a property. They have a buyer. The buyer has a letter of intent from a grocery store chain that it's actually like, was working on this for a couple months before I took office, as I was in like the opposite of a lame duck period. And so just, letting folks know, like, look, I will fight for this. Please let me know what I can do to help. Like if it's grant funding for a tenant build out, if it's permitting approval. I mean, I think in this case, I said, like, if you get it done without me, that's awesome. If you don't get it done and you didn't ask me for help, I'm going to be upset. It's because like we are missing a really important opportunity for a neighborhood here. I think just helping make clear that as, a council member and someone who can kind of help make connections to maybe grant funders or state grants or whatever, right? Communicating that in of itself is I think a really important thing. You can organizing neighborhoods, getting, neighborhood associations expressing support for that type of thing, right? Is very in line with that. This sort of falls outside the policy realm, but it's something I've been seeing is that when I think as a local elected official, where it's not about, oh, this great policy or even about like moving things around in the budget always. Sometimes it's getting the right people together in a meeting, right? Having the power to get the right people together in a meeting and work those types of things. And so I know that's probably not the answer that a lot of listeners, certainly myself a couple of years ago, I would not have been looking for that. But I think that's actually really important. Outside of that, there are ways to have tax credits and other types of things of that to attract grocery store tenants. And then just having we have the Baltimore Development Corporation, right? They have economic development folks, making sure that that's a good priority for them. All these things are actively helping, like looking for grocery store chains that fit, in our case, in our dense urban environment, right? Because
Mhm.
a lot of the national chains have a specific model that rarely makes sense here. And a big part of the reason we have a food desert problem is because the U.S. is dominated by a small number of grocery store chains, and their model is inherently very intensely suburban. You need, or at least you think you need, 200 parking spaces, and you need an aisle for your tomato sauce, right? Your 50 different brands of
Mhm.
tomatoes. And not to be disparaging there, but because where space is cheap, right? You can do that, and that's just a challenge we have. The last one that I'll say that is a specific interest of mine is a state level law in Maryland that does not allow beer and wine in grocery stores. There's been some discussion over the last 2 years. Maryland is one of 3 states in the country that does not allow beer. I mean, one of 10 that does not allow wine in grocery stores. And what's nice about beer and wine is they're dense. The profit margins are high, and you're not worried about, like, the logistics are a lot easier. You're not worried about
Mhm.
things going stale and all that type of stuff. And so we actually have had a couple of our members of our state delegation, meaning the state level elected officials in Baltimore City, who have been advocating for basically allowing for grocery stores to sell beer and wine in places that don't have grocery stores. And they've had some really creative ideas. Delegate Marlon Ampry in West Baltimore had a particularly cool set of things where it's like we can have a surtax on the beer and wine that's allowed in the grocery stores, and that would go towards funding projects and efforts for our for breweries across the state, and like helping with smaller scale beer and wine production. And so, like, that type of thing, I was like, oh man, this is my jam. Unfortunately, the liquor lobby is actually really strong in Maryland right now. I don't think the political will to push through that opposition is going to allow that. And there's a lot of places in the state that don't have that negative impact from this that Baltimore City does, right? And so
Mhm.
it's hard to get votes, on the state level for that. But so there's multiple things there that all overlap in figuring out how to get more grocery stores in.
Yeah, and I like that from our conversation, you kind of realize it's a multi-level fight. Like you need people pushing for federal change, and then
Yeah.
you also need someone who can put the right people together in a room in Baltimore to talk about a solution. So it's fun and interesting to view so many different angles of the same fight. So as we wind down, I want to ask you about two more initiatives that ILSR is working on in and
Yeah.
around Baltimore. First, ILSR did some work that found that the city of Baltimore, which is home to large waste incinerators, has repeatedly ranked nationally for poor air quality and the worst urban heat among US cities,
Yeah.
which is a problem that's exacerbated in poor and black neighborhoods.
Yep.
At ILSR, we've been working with State Delegate Regina T. Boyce on a bill to create a solid waste surcharge to help fund food waste prevention and composting programs, which could be seen as solutions to this problem. Does the issue show up in your district, and how can City Council help ensure environmental equity for all
Yeah.
Baltimoreans?
Yeah. First off, Delegate Boyce is great. That's awesome. I didn't know y'all were working with her. I'm going to text her after this. She had a really big legislative win last year in allowing and enabling legislation to allow the city of Baltimore and counties across the state to tax abandoned properties at higher rates to disincentivize blight. That was huge.
Which is a great
Um,
idea. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And I'm looking forward to learning more about this from her. But they're actually a big example. The 10th largest trash incinerator in America used to be in the 11th district, my district, and with redistricting that moved into the adjacent district, the 10th. Um, that incinerator, because of some pretty bad state laws, regulation, I should say, has been receiving millions of dollars a year in out of our renewable energy portfolio. Somehow a push to stop that in 2019 died, but it actually is back on the chopping block now. It's a state level thing that has to happen, but it has support from my state senator, who is the Senate president. So the fact that he sponsored the bill now, right, is a really good sign that it'll push through. They actually have the hearing tomorrow. Councilman Porter just introduced a resolution on the council level to say, hey, we all support the state removing incinerators out of the renewable energy portfolio. That's $25 million the state of Maryland, government is going to save just by not pretending like incinerators are the type of energy we want in our state. And so that's huge. Also, talking incinerator stuff, you have to look at composting, right? You have to look at what are our landfill options. If you lose an incinerator, you right that there it is generating electricity, and our electrical rates, which is another conversation, have been going up substantially. And so, like, what the impact on that is, figuring out how to offset that with substantial investments in green energy, as well as figuring out what to do with the trash and being proactive. All these things they're easy to brief, but then figuring out the nuts and bolts of how you run a municipal composting program, like of the scale that actually gets things out of the burner, right, is not easy. And especially in a city that's as racked with the challenges of both the history of racism as well as like car centered everything, right? Like, we're really broke financially. So being smart and being able to work these things out is kind of how you have to do it.
Yeah. Well, and I know the compost team at ILSR is really proud to provide great resources and help for exactly that. Okay, yet another intersection with ILSR's work. We do a ton of work with local broadband and connectivity, and that team has found that Baltimore has one of the highest rates of digital disconnectivity in the nation. ILSR profiled Baltimore's Project Waves, which is an organization working to close that digital divide. And I'll link to that story and some others in the show notes. Why is connectivity important for the Baltimore community, and what do you think some solutions could be when the Comcast monopoly is so clearly leaving so many Baltimoreans behind?
Yeah. Um, and this is a specific thing where my job in the Marine Corps was a little tech related. And so, like, I've got a little bit of an understanding of more than I would otherwise, right? Of the technical side of this. First off, we have a lot of challenges with internet connectivity across the city, even in our more fluent neighborhoods, which is crazy because they're, relatively fluent even on national level, but also they're very dense. So it really makes no sense why you'd have a problem there. But then, of course, where is it worse? It's always going to be worse in your historically disadvantaged neighborhoods, right? Your lower income neighborhoods. The most blatant example of that was during COVID when schools went virtual. And then, the amount of kids who dropped out of school, grades, truancy rate, all that type of thing. Just like took a massive hit. It was the most obvious example of that. But the full scale of, there's so many things, there's reasons to be moving towards telehealth. There's obviously impacts on the education system. There's all these different, just getting information, applying for a job, all these sorts of things that like tie into network. And I think that people understand that, but figuring out, what options are out there for municipalities, is really important.
Yeah, and again, ILSR, ton of resources, ton of work in local broadband, and again, we'll link that to the in the show notes. All right, one more question. You've already mentioned Delegate Boyce being awesome. I'm interested in where your political inspiration comes from. So, where do you see great work happening, and what kind of stuff in cities inspire you to keep doing your work?
Man, that's cool. Yeah, here's like maybe three of them. So in Baltimore, we have real challenges around, as with any area that's going to have large areas of concentrated poverty, right? We have all sorts of challenges with substance abuse, with violent crime, with things like this. And the way that you can, a lot of times, the most effective way to like get people the resources they need and understand what's going on and whatnot is to have people who share that life experience being the messengers and coordinating that. And that's everything from, we recently started a program, and including at the high school that I coach at, where we're piloting it now, but it's looking really effective, where we have, adults who come from the same neighborhoods that the kids are coming from, serving, outside of school hours in the surrounding neighborhood, as well as inside of school hours, providing wraparound services, mediating things, kind of like, just like bringing the temperature down when that needs to happen, right? The value of being able to have people who understand where the people who are most vulnerable are coming from and can communicate them from a credible messaging perspective is awesome. And I think when you talk about local power and recognizing that, like, having that neighborhood level or like life understanding that people have, and a lot of times not everyone can make those connections, right? And so that's actually really inspiring. I think we're doing some really good stuff, both the city and some of our nonprofit partners there. Actually, the homicide rate in Baltimore last year was like 40% lower than it was 2 years ago. It's been dropping. It looks like it's going to continue dropping. We're seeing the same with
Mhm.
shootings. Like these types of things. There's real outcomes here. Some of the lowest we've had in 50 years. Another example, another thing I'm really excited about, changing subjects, but when it comes to like interstate and highway removal, because there's nothing that destroys a neighborhood like putting an interstate or a highway by it. And a lot of times that was done intentionally because there were certain neighborhoods that for whatever reason the city wanted destroyed. A lot of times, aspects of race and class play into that.
Mhm.
Um, and we have a couple of examples of that in the city that are like prime candidates for that. And so I know in Rochester has a successful example of that. There's some older examples. I think San Francisco, Milwaukee has had one the last 15 years or so. And so looking at that type of things, which make stronger neighborhoods, connect neighborhoods, and just generate the revenue that a municipality needs to be strong are incredibly important. Really exciting stuff being
Mhm.
done kind of across the country there. Lastly, main streets, commercial neighborhood corridors is like
Mhm.
having a vibrant neighborhood space, particularly in, to kind of brag about Baltimore. The bones of the city are just like, there's not a lot of places that can compete with it. And so, if you have, it's the place itself, it's part of the reason people are coming. It's part of the reason that people are
Yeah.
spending their money there, right? It also has a huge impact on how people think about the neighborhood and about the city, right? So being able to have meaningful support for these types of programs and nonprofits that support the commercial corridor in a space is
Yeah.
huge. I know there's been some work in Atlanta and Boston that looks at these commercial corridors and says, hey, like all these like crazy national like tax write-offs and whatnot you get for having retail vacancy, like we are going to like you will be fined or have a fee or whatever to
Mhm.
basically if you're going to blight the surrounding neighborhood, like you're because it's in your like federal tax interest to do that, we are going to do our part to discourage that behavior. And I think that type of stuff is we have to get a good holistic package of effort there as a city, and that's super inspiring stuff.
Yeah, well, and one of the reasons I love Baltimore is it's small businesses. I'm a bookstore guy, and you've got
Yeah.
just incredible bookstores there. Red Emma's, Atomic Bookshop.
Yeah.
These places are great. And I'll mention that ILSR just published a post about how city governments can work with independent business alliances to accomplish these kind of goals that you're talking about with bolstering up main streets. Well, Zac Blanchard, what a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks a ton, Danny. And thanks for having me on the show.
I really enjoyed talking to Councilman Blanchard about all the ways his experience and ideas intersect with ILSR's priorities and resources. Please do check out the show notes for links to all kinds of those resources, from composting to local broadband to the grocery price crisis and how to fix it. To keep up with our work on all these issues and more, subscribe to our flagship Localism Works newsletter, which you can do with the link in the show notes. Here at Building Local Power, we'd love to invite you, our listeners, into the conversation. If you have thoughts about this or other episodes, ideas for future guests, or if you just want to get in touch, send me a note at buildinglocalpower@ilsr.org. And as always, if you like what you hear, please like, subscribe, review, and share with your friends. This episode of Building Local Power was produced by me, Danny Caine, with the help of Reggie Rucker. I did the editing with help from Taya Noel, who also composed the music. Thank you so much for listening, and see you in 2 weeks.